Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this evening, this Wednesday evening to discuss Linux, a subject that I'm always excited to chat about, and hopefully, everyone here has heard the word Linux, or would just like to find a bit more about what it is, what people use it for, why you've heard the term, what's the difference between Linux and Unix, because those two terms are used a lot. So we're going to race through the history of the Linux operating system. We're going to talk about why it's important, why I think it's important, why, frankly, I think everyone should use Linux, whether you are a very seasoned computer professional and have used Mac and Windows for years, or whether you're a tinkerer and hacker type, or whether you're just a bit curious. So we're going to take you through all that today. Please excuse the American accent. I've lived in the UK for 25 years, but I can't seem to get rid of it. So sadly, it's going to be with us tonight. So first of all, and I kind of set the scene there a bit, why a talk on Linux? So I think a lot of people enter the world of computers. I mean, nowadays, really, it's through your phone with iOS or Android, an iPhone or a various Android phone. When we think of laptops and desktop computers, really, we're only thinking of two different types. People are thinking of a Windows laptop. Most people in enterprise or in work situations, when issued a laptop or a computer, is a Microsoft Windows run computer. Or we're thinking about Apple Macs, so MacBooks, MacBook Pros, or Mac Minis or iMacs or those types of computers. And generally, the computing world focuses nowadays in 2024 on those two areas. And it's a real shame because there's a lot of other good operating systems. There's a lot of different hardware out there. And it's nice to be able to break out of those two areas and see what's new and what's exciting and what's been there for many years. So we're going to go through the history of Apple and Microsoft and Linux and help you guys kind of see where Linux wedges its way into those two, between those two different types of operating systems. So I guess a bigger question in 2024 is, why do operating systems even matter? Really, if you look at percentages, most people are doing their work on phones these days. The company that I work for, we do web development and mobile app development. Most of our work is on mobile these days because most people are accessing the internet or writing their emails, and they're doing it on mobile phones, on the two main mobile operating systems. But when we take a look back at computers as a whole, laptops and desktops, they're still very important to a lot of the work we do. And hopefully, I'll make a strong case that there's one operating system that we should all consider and look at again. So quickly, my background. I'm CEO and founder of Mission Control. So, as mentioned, we're a company based in the UK in Milton Keynes. And actually, we were originally based in Bletchley Park, which is how I got to know the National Museum of Computing and the gang there. We were in Bletchley Park for almost 8 years. And our focus has always been on web and mobile development, but we're also a big open source team, and we're very into Linux, and we're just a big bunch of geeky hacker types. So we'll start out this talk with a quick quote from someone we're going to find out more about, a man named Richard Stallman, one of the two important people we're going to talk about related to Linux tonight. And this quote: "Spreading the idea of freedom is a big job. It needs your help." So a lot of what we talk about tonight, terms open source, Linux, free software, they all wrap around this idea of freedom. Now, and freedom, not as in it's free, it doesn't cost money, but freedom as you can use this and there aren't strings attached. I think more and more nowadays we're seeing what those strings are. If we go to free websites, it's usually advertising. If we use Gmail, they're harvesting information about us. If we use Windows, we're getting ads injected into Windows. We're getting monitored. If we're using Apple, we're locked into that ecosystem. We can only install what they tell us or have blessed worthy of installing. We are not really in that term free. And the beginning of computing and certainly of the internet was all about that freedom. And we're going to touch on why Linux is really the only choice when it comes to doing what you want to do, owning your data, which is a big thing these days, of course, and owning your computing experience. That's very much the Linux mantra. So very quickly, 4 different areas we're going to touch on. There's so much to talk about. This is going to be about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for question and answers. I tend to talk fast, so I'm sorry about that. I'll try to slow down at a few points. But these 4 areas we're going to hit: lightning fast history of Linux. We're going to talk about why it matters in 2024, why we're even talking about it, why, in my humble opinion, it's better than the other operating systems, why it's the best, and why you should try it, and a quick few tips and pointers on how to try it, how to dip your toe in the water and try this new operating system, this new experience that you might not have tried before. So let's start with a bit of a history. We're going to kind of rush forwards and backwards. So not quite in the beginning. As I mentioned, we all know Apple, Windows, Microsoft, those words. Thinking about the National Museum of Computing, it all started, of course, with Colossus. Then we've got the revolutionary Apple II, the Macintosh, and Windows. These things we know about. These things happened a lot more recently than some of the older bits that formed the beginning of Linux. And that was actually back in the 1960s. There was a group, a lab created by AT&T in the US, AT&T's famous Bell Labs, where, among other things, they were groundbreaking, coming up with a lot of different means of communication, all of it based around AT&T's desire to, really monopolize technology based on communication. Obviously, at the time, it was phones, but they wanted to see where everything was going and coming up with a lot of really exciting things. And one of the things they came up with was an operating system language, an operating system called Unix. So Unix is really the core of everything that we talk about today. Unix was developed to be modular. So modular, we're going to try not to get too technical today. We're going to stay kind of high level. But that basically means there are a lot of different components that make this operating system do what it does. So you can build bits and plug them together. And that's important when we come to Linux and free software and how these were built by hobbyists effectively and put together. Unix also has a simple file hierarchy, and that basically means files on your computers that today. You can nest things and store them. The operating system itself really thinks about things in terms of files. All the files come together and form the OS. And the final bit is portability. That's super important. So back in the 60s, there were obviously not a lot of computers to access. That was the case through the 70s and even the early 80s, where major computers would be on academic campuses or in enterprises or major institutions, but a lot of people didn't have access. What Unix actually gave people was the ability to move an operating system to lots of different types of hardware that were in different places, developed by different companies, and actually it could run. So it could move and go to different pieces of hardware. And that point's really important as we come into what Linux is and why it's important. Let's flash forward again back to the 80s. A couple of dates, the Apple Mac, and these are kind of considered 3 big dates in the 80s, certainly to me. The Mac, 1984, of course. Microsoft Windows, quickly trying to catch up, comes out in 1985. And Richard Stallman authors what I will explain now is the GNU Manifesto. So let's talk about the first guy that we'll get to know tonight, Richard Stallman. So he really is known as kind of a hacker's hacker. He is the founder of the free software movement. I think many lectures could be done just on him. So from a very high level, he was a hacker in the late 70s, early 80s. He worked mainly out of MIT's computer lab. And the MIT computer lab was somewhat, certainly in the early 80s, of a kind of a growing area of hacker community. People would stay up all night and come up with programs and share code and help each other out. He was one of that team. And the more he got into it, the more he started thinking that actually some of these, what we call proprietary bits of software, don't make any sense from the way he was brought up and the way he saw computing, and a lot of people did at the time. Computers and software were meant to be free. They were meant to be shared. You shouldn't have to pay for software. No one should own it. No one should tell you you can't change it or look at the source code. He believed it was for everyone. And he used a story, and still does, about recipes. Say you give your friend a recipe for chocolate chip cookies, and they take the recipe that's written down and they like it, but they add a bit more sugar, a bit of honey, or white chocolate chips. That should be allowed. They should be allowed to do that. Take your recipe and add to it, make it their own. But proprietary software says what Apple and Microsoft and a lot of companies say is, here's the recipe, you can't change it. You have to cook them exactly like that, no changes whatsoever. If you do, then you are a pirate. You are doing something illegally. You can be prosecuted. So that's more or less the metaphor here to making code free in his mind. And I think a lot of hackers and computer people see coding and development as a very creative art. And you're creating something that you don't want rules around, that you want to hand to somebody else and let them create. And that's what Richard Stallman put together. And he decided that outside of these operating systems that cost money and are locked down and software that's locked down, he wanted to start his own free operating system for everybody to use. No cost. You could take it, do whatever you want with it, and it was free to everyone. And he named it the GNU Project. So hackers have this thing where they like to do recursive acronyms, which basically means they put the title of the product in the product's acronym. So GNU, GNU, stands for GNU is not Unix. And GNU is important because that was the beginning in the late 80s of putting together one free operating system. And really, Richard Stallman and a group that came to be known as the Free Software Foundation started writing this on their own. They started writing all the elements that you need to make an operating system, to make a computer work, and to run all the programs and the applications you want. So they built all types of storage and something called the GNU compiler, which compiled code. They did a lot on file management and memory management. They basically, by the end of the 1980s, had built absolutely everything that was required to run an operating system, except for one thing. And that thing was the kernel. So that word kernel, you've probably heard, and it's something that comes up quite a bit when we talk about operating systems or firmware. A kernel, in essence, is what speaks to the hardware on a system. A kernel is one of the most important pieces. It's also one of the most difficult ones to build. So they put off building the kernel till the end for various reasons I won't get into, but they had built everything but the kernel, in some ways the heart of the operating system that basically tells the hardware what to do. It tells the hardware when to run a program, when to handle events, timers, memory management, and tasks. It is one of the most important timekeepers of the whole system. So we're in 1991, and we have almost a complete operating system from Richard Stallman, the GNU operating system, but there is no kernel. Enter Linus Torvalds, the second guy we'll talk about tonight, and he is a Finnish student based in Finland in the early 90s who had his own computer, very much a hacker tinkerer, and played with another free educational operating system called Minix, made by a guy named Andrew Tannenbaum, who we won't get into. We're going to try to keep eye level. But Minix was a free system that allowed people to put it on their home computers and play a little bit with it. But what Linus wanted is he wanted more of a Unix experience. He wanted a full operating system. He saw the GNU project and saw that it wasn't complete, so he couldn't use it. But he was really attracted to the free software movement. He went to a lecture by Richard Stallman, and although he thought it kind of weird, he loved the rough idea of what they were trying to do. And plus, he liked doing things himself. So he sat down to write a kernel, which eventually became the Linux kernel. And so, cutting a very long story short, the two elements then were able to come together. So the GNU project having everything but a kernel, and the Linux kernel written by Linus Torvalds came together to be known as GNU Linux. Now, a lot of people today forget the GNU part and just simply call it Linux. They call the whole operating system Linux. In fact, I did by titling this talk. But really, to be fair to all of the work that Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation did, some people would argue 75% of the work, it's more appropriate to call the whole system GNU Linux. But that is a big argument we will not get into. So let's talk about the timeline a bit. So the GNU Linux project, this free operating system that now had all the components to work, started to be distributed around 1991. In other words, people started to hear about it. Now, it wasn't general news. Back then, in the early 90s, thankfully, we had this convergence of technologies happening, and one of those was the advent of the internet. So Linux would certainly never have taken off the way it did if it didn't hit this timeline almost perfectly. People started sharing things online. Certainly more technical people and hackers were sharing a bit of code and sharing a bit of information about projects they were working on. And eventually, the Linux kernel and the accompanying GNU products that plugged together to make an operating system, word got out. People started playing with it. Big areas started opening up, areas being message boards where people were creating what they called distributions. So a distribution is effectively plugging all those parts that I mentioned together into one, if you will, file or one element that you could give to people or distribute it, get it out to them, let them run it on their computers. So aside from a few kind of skunkworks distributions, bigger companies started to wrap together these tools into an operating system. Companies that you might have heard of called Debian, which is more or less known as the first distribution, although of course there's arguments around that. Red Hat, Slackware was an early one, SUSE Linux in Germany, and these companies started to create what we call distributions, or you've probably heard that term distros. So people say, which Linux distro do you run? And that's where this word comes from. So effectively, you can run a Debian distro, a Red Hat, a SUSE distro. They're all Linux. They're all GNU Linux. They all have effectively the same framework. There's just a few differences. And as I mentioned with the chef and the recipe, just a few little added differences between these, but they're all essentially Linux. So once those companies started making distributions, and people were starting to get Linux easier now because they were in a single file, it was in a single place, Silicon Valley started getting involved. And around the mid to late 90s, a fantastic piece of open source software that ran on Linux called the Apache Web Server gets really important in our story. So the internet is growing. Websites are starting to be built and are growing, and e-commerce is starting. And all of these websites need to go out on the internet, and they need a server to broadcast those websites to the internet. So servers are starting to grow up. What we now know as the cloud is starting to grow. All of those servers need what's called a web server, which is an application that, again, serves those pages. One of the best and easiest to use at the time was Apache. It was free, which is fantastic. Sun and Microsoft's NT, they were all charging ridiculous rates to set up servers using their software. So companies, even big companies, were setting up Linux machines with an Apache server on them. So immediately Linux started to grow. And by the end of the 90s, companies that were helping support these servers and support Linux were actually starting to get listed on the NASDAQ in the US. They were starting to IPO. So Red Hat IPO'd in the late 90s, I think 99. VA Linux a company who's not actually not around anymore. I believe at the time were the biggest tech IPO in history. So these two companies, Red Hat and VA Linux, as well as SUSE and some other companies, they provide support services. Obviously, the software is free; it's Linux, but people and companies running big server farms and big, expensive infrastructures needed support. And these guys saw that that could be a great business. So then we get into the early 2000s, and people are starting to think about Linux actually, while it's dominating the server space, being quite useful on the desktop as well. So we are at this time very used to Windows and Mac, although Mac is in its painful decline in the early 2000s. It's starting to come back, but most people in the early 2000s are using Windows. And that is very much a user interface that you guys know well, a windowing user interface, a GUI that's easy to use, a point and click, a drag and drop. It's in front of you. You use a mouse and a keyboard, nice and easy to use. Linux for a long time remained very technical. It remained a terminal-based operating system. You know, you needed to know some of the tools and how to code and how to interact and the shortcuts. So desktops were needed. So a couple of projects started spinning up, and I'm obviously generalizing because a lot of these started earlier, but two that we're going to talk about, KDE, which is that K at the bottom there, and that little footprint is a project called GNOME, GNOME. So some people call it GNOME or GNOME. And those are two desktop environments. So what is a desktop environment? Basically, a desktop environment is put on top of Linux or the backend of the operating system to give you that interface, to give you, for lack of a better term, a Windows Mac-like interface to let you interact with it and really use the operating system as a daily laptop, desktop operating system. Here's a couple of screen grabs just to give you a feel. And later, when we get to the Q&A section, I might actually just bring up my desktop and show you a bit of how I've organized it. But if we look on the left, this is KDE, which looks kind of like Windows. We've got almost a start button at the bottom left. We've got almost a kind of a start panel that pops up with your apps and your files. And so that KDE is often quite good for people moving from Windows and want to try Linux. They will use a KDE desktop environment. Likewise, people coming from Mac and the Apple experience, people who like docks and things, tend to gravitate towards GNOME. GNOME is the one on the right-hand side. It's got the dock, familiar to Mac users, of course. It's a bit more modern. There's more animations. It's more rounded. It's got that modern aesthetic to it. But that's the thing about Linux is, irregardless of where you come from, you can choose any type of experience you want. We're going to get more into that in a minute. So early 2000s, Linux starts to capture, and no joke, about 96% of the world's servers. So Linux, whether you like it, whether you know it or not, is everywhere, and it's serving you all your web pages, whether you're on Apple, Mac, or an iPhone, or an Android phone, or Windows, you are getting served technology pages from a Linux server. So Linux dominates in the cloud. It still does. But that's not the end of the story, because as we get towards 2007, 2008, mobile came into play. 2007, famously, Steve Jobs and the iPhone. You know, this sounds a lot like what we were talking about with Windows and the first Mac in 1984. A year later comes Android in 2008. Google purchased the Android project and took it in-house and started developing a Android operating system for phones. And what's interesting about Android is it needed a kernel to run it. And of course, Android runs on lots of different pieces of hardware, lots of different companies. So the project needed a kernel that was flexible and portable, all those things we talked about. So of course they chose Linux. So the Linux kernel runs inside of Android. Obviously it's highly customized now for Android's needs. But in essence, if you have an Android phone in your pocket, you are running Linux. The kernel is in there, and it's in 70% of the world's mobile phones, because Android is obviously quite huge. Not as big, say, in the United States, but certainly in the rest of the world, to take at least 70% of the world's phones. So all that's fine and good. We've talked about cloud. Linux is there. 96% of the servers have Linux. 70% of the phones have Linux. But why don't we ever hear about Linux? And, why don't we ever use it on our computers? Is Linux destined to just be this kind of back end thing that techies know about? Well, the desktop is a funny place because it's owned by obviously very big companies, whether they're hardware or software companies, and it became owned by two major companies, Microsoft and Apple. And for many years, we in the Linux community from, the early 2000s onward, had hoped for this big year, what we call in quotes, year of the Linux desktop, because we couldn't understand why it just wasn't happening. So it's become a meme and a bit of a joke in the Linux community over the years, because each year, come December for the estimates and predictions of what comes next year, or in January for what's about to come, everyone would say, this is going to be the year of the Linux desktop. Well, it never really came. It never came in a big way because companies like Dell or Lenovo or HP or Apple simply didn't put Linux on their hardware, on their machines, and sold it to you. So in order for you to actually use Linux, you have to strip off the operating system that comes on the hardware you're given and put Linux on it. And because Linux is free and open and nobody can charge a license fee or royalty, there hadn't for a long time been any incentive for those hardware manufacturers to put Linux on it because they could obviously charge a royalty for Windows. Apple, with the Mac OS, locks you in and keeps you into that environment. So it would never behoove them to put another operating system on. So effectively, Linux, for all its beautiful parts, its freedom, has lost in a lot of ways that race to get onto hardware and to be sold in shops and to be in PC World or Best Buy. But there's actually some positive elements to that. And perhaps the year of the Linux desktop is still coming in some ways. And for a lot of people, it's already come. And we'll talk a bit about that. But let's get into Linux in 2024. So why change, right? So Windows and Mac, they're getting better and better. They are great, stable, mature operating systems. Enterprises, workplaces, Fortune 500 companies, they use Windows. They wouldn't change. They pay massive license fees to Microsoft. Microsoft does everything to keep them. The creative space loves Apple. More and more businesses and enterprises are actually bringing Apple on board as well. So most of what you see, certainly in your work life, is going to be Windows or Mac. And most of what you're sold as a consumer when you go out to PC World or look on Amazon is either Windows or Mac. That's it. That's all you see. And for good reason. They're great, solid operating systems. But they're not the only one. And in my mind, and a point I'll kind of put through, is I think Linux is better because Linux can be yours. It's not the vision of the designers in Cupertino designing the Apple operating system, nor the designers in Redmond for Microsoft coming up with the next feature and bolting that on to all the old features. You can actually customize it and make it your operating system. And it's pretty cool. So let's talk about what are kind of in my eyes, the kind of top reasons why Linux and freedom is important. So why should software be open and free? We talked about that term free, and Richard Stallman uses this a lot just to get the point across. It's not free as in beer, it's free as in freedom. So again, especially in today's tech world, you get a lot of stuff for free, but it's not free. And I'm sure you guys know that. And I think that argument's getting a lot more life these days, especially when it comes to advertising and data farming and privacy. You use these tools and believe me, they are not free. So what you have to kind of think about is what are the reasons you may want to go through a bit of work to move from Windows or Apple to Linux and what you get out of it. So reason number one, it's secure and transparent. So Linux is very secure. We worry about security. We worry about privacy. Windows, for instance, you get shipped awful software like McAfee. Those kind of pieces of software effectively are Some of the worst bits of software in the world. I really hope most of you guys have ripped that off your computers. If not, we'll talk afterwards. But those are selling a fear of viruses and all these issues that not necessarily aren't founded, because there's plenty of viruses and issues on Windows, but they take advantage of fear in a lot of the ways that the advertisers do as well. And they sell you products to keep you safe, because a lot of the malicious software that's out there is written to get into institutions and banks and companies that run Windows. But Linux doesn't have that. There's not, in general, and this is a big generalization because there are malicious actors who do write things to get into Linux systems, but on the whole, it's much more secure. And the reason for that is the transparency. The source code of every Linux distribution that you might use, any piece of open source software that you use, is by definition open. So everyone can look at the source code, and they do. You get a community of a lot of people looking at code, fixing bugs, identifying issues, identifying vulnerabilities much faster than any company who hires a team can do. And so Linux, by definition, has more eyeballs and more security by definition than any of these other operating systems. It's also easy to use and expand. A lot of people think of Linux and Unix, those words just sound so techy and it's difficult to use, and I'm gonna have to learn some code. And actually nowadays in 2024, you never have to interact with what we call a terminal. So you don't have to type in code. You don't have to type commands. It's as easy to use as Windows, in some ways easier. And again, you could expand it. You can make it your own. You could add new bits. You could add animations. You could add a workflow that matches how you do your job, how you work. Of course, the community I mentioned in the security aspects, obviously people looking at code, checking it out, checking for vulnerabilities, fixing bugs, giving advice. But the community is more than that. The Linux community, and there's tons of forums. If you decide you like Ubuntu or Fedora or Arch or Manjaro, these are distribution names I'm mentioning. They all have forums. They've got loyal users. Everybody's there to help you out. They love newbies. At least some of the distributions do. We won't get into the annoying cloistered ones. But in general, people are very welcoming. And, to them, it's getting more users on Linux, and that's the important thing. And, really just kind of wrap that up, be the user, not the product. And I think that's important. I think that message comes through more and more these days with things like social media and Google searches and soon AI that is wanting to look at your history, what you do on computers, and they give you all of those wonderful, fun things for free, but there is a cost at the end of the day. And then finally, for me, what I always say is it's just more fun. Linux is so much fun. It's fun to, almost in a maker's way, make your own operating system, add things that you kind of like, add, kind of flashy things. You can have different types, as I mentioned, animations and colors and themes. You could change your cursor. You can change your icons. You can change everything that Apple and Windows say, no, we know best. Keep it looking just like this. So it's a lot more fun. So really, the question becomes, how do you want to work? And this will then be in kind of your court to think about, okay, do I want something simple that is easy to use, kind of like Windows, but it is Linux, I can try it? Well, there's a choice for you. There's Ubuntu, and we'll talk more about Ubuntu in a minute. There's Fedora. These are good, stable, beginner type distributions that you can simply download and give it a try. It'll be familiar, be easy to use. If you're a bit more adventurous, or let's say you're a gamer and you play a lot of games, you're going to want to get a distribution that's tailored for games. Pop! OS is a good one for games. Linux Mint is a good one for Windows users. Arch Linux, you might have heard about that, is great for a more advanced tinkerer type of user. If you're a security-minded person or you do penetration testing, there's Kali Linux for that. If you like something that actually looks exactly like Windows, you might like something like Zorin. If you like something that looks exactly like Apple Mac, you might like Elementary OS. All of these are Linux distributions. All have the GNU Linux systems that are put together, invented in the 90s and had that birth through the 2000s that I mentioned, but all have different seasoning in them and are just a little bit different. And it's kind of fun to try them all and just see what suits you. I mean, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different distributions to try, but also there's a lot of different desktop environments to try. So those distributions that I mentioned, those are the system, the backend, the pipes that work. You can put any desktop environment you want on just about any distribution. So that means I can run Ubuntu or I can run Fedora, but I can put KDE Plasma on top of it. So my desktop environment is KDE, or I can have a desktop environment that's GNOME, or there's others called XFCE or LXDE or LXQT. You can even use a window manager if you like tiling, which is basically means separating your screen into sections. There are what's called tiling window managers that you can use, i3 and Awesome and all of these different types of systems. So it's almost too much to talk about, and it's a rabbit hole that if you have even the smallest bit of interest, you'll start to fall into, which is, what distribution do I like? And then, gosh, what interface would I like? Because there's so many different options. So if all of that sounds kind of interesting and you want to give it a go, hopefully some of you have seen a Linux distribution before, but if not, it's really easy to do, especially in 2024. It's actually easier than you think. So installing Linux, and mainly these next few slides are focused to people with a Windows machine. And the reason for that is Linux runs typically really well on x86 machines. Apple is switched mainly to ARM-based. They have their M1, M2, M3, M4 computers now. There are ways to run it. There's a project called Asahi Linux, which runs on these new Mac computers, but that's a bit more difficult to put together. So let's start. If you have a Windows machine of any type, and keep in mind, Linux runs very low resources, which means it runs beautifully on older machines. So don't worry about having the latest and greatest. If you've got a machine that's 5 years old, 7 years old, let's say you've got an old laptop, you haven't fired it up in 6 years, I bet it's going to run Linux beautifully. And that's because Linux doesn't have all of the cruft, all of the legacy weight of things like Windows and Apple, and also isn't trying to feed you ads and stop up all your processes with all this nonsense. So Linux is clean, it's light, and it revives old hardware incredibly well. So message being, if you've got an old piece of hardware, great. That's a great place to make a little home lab, try a Linux distribution, see if you like it. But even if you have a new machine or one machine or your main machine and you still want to try it, you can try it without actually installing it. And the reason for this is Linux can actually run on a USB stick. And that's what we're going to talk about, is actually running what's called a live ISO or a live instance just from the USB stick and never touching your hard drive, never wiping your machine or taking out Windows, but just trying it on an ISO. So the first way to start with this is to look for an easy distribution. You can obviously look for the hardcore ones later. I would say start with the main two, in my mind, that are easy to get started with, Ubuntu and Fedora. So again, you've probably heard those words. Ubuntu is one of the bigger ones. Certainly in the UK, it was started by Mark Shuttleworth and became really, for lack of a better term, the default Linux distribution the past, say, 20 years or so. It's falling off that level because they've moved their focus away from the desktop. But Ubuntu is easy Linux. It's easy to use. I think that they used to have a strapline. It's friendly Linux. And so I recommend going to the Ubuntu site, going to the desktop section and downloading their latest desktop, or going to Fedora. Fedora is part of the Red Hat company, but it's its own project. It's an open source project, part of Red Hat. And they call their distribution a workstation. So you'll go to Fedora and download Fedora Workstation. You go to Ubuntu and download the Ubuntu desktop. Very easy. Go to the sites. It's about 2.5 gigs each. So take a little time, but go and download those. So you'll go to their site and download what's called an ISO, ISO. The ISO is the operating system. It's that distribution, that kind of holy grail single file we've been talking about for a while now. So you'll go and find that large file, that ISO. Then you'll get yourself, actually look in your drawer. I'm sure you've got 1,000 randomly branded old USB sticks. Doesn't matter. They do need to have really about 6 gigs or more, but 8 gigs is safe. And what's going to happen is you're going to wipe everything that's on this USB drive. It's going to put the ISO on for you. You'll download a bit of software, a lot of different options. And incidentally, I'll give you information about how to get more easier steps to go through this. But you'll download something. There's an application called Etcher. You can download your ISO file, plug in your USB drive. It will copy that file over into the drive. You'll reboot your machine and ask your machine to boot from the USB stick instead of the hard drive that's in your computer. And effectively, you will then be booted right into Linux. So in this case, this is Ubuntu, and it would take you straight into a live experience. So you can actually be in an Ubuntu desktop. It'll already have applications in it. You can try the browser, you can look at the files, you could play around and just see how it feels and see how similar it is and see how easy it is really to use, and how much it will remind you of Windows and Mac and all of the different experiences you've had. And if you love it, actually with that USB stick, there will be the option to install it. So let's hope you really love it, because you're going to wipe your machine and click install. So I would recommend download a couple of these different distros: Fedora, Ubuntu, try Linux Mint, try Manjaro. All of them a little bit different, again, a little bit different seasoning, but really fun in their own way. And if you find one you like, that's when, once you've started it up and you're looking at it, you click install, and then that Linux distribution will be on your main machine. You'll be off and running. It's a big day, by the way, when you decide to what we call nuke and pave. You nuke your machine, get rid of Windows, and pave it fresh with Linux. So to make sure people are around and you can pop some champagne. So all of that, as far as installing, I really rushed through it. And, if you guys are on the techier side, and I'm sorry if you are, and this has been painful to listen to me talk through these steps, you know how to do this: burn an ISO and install it. For others who don't, I love helping with this kind of thing, honestly. So take down my email address, eddie@mcontrol.com. And I'm happy to help. I'll take you through the steps, jump on a Zoom with you and get you up and running. Because really, I think it's important for more people to try Linux, to see how easy it is, to see how fun it is, to get you out of those walled gardens of Windows and Apple, and to really help you to kind of enjoy your computers again. When I got into Linux in the early 2000s, I was always an Apple fanboy. I loved everything Apple. Kind of had to use Windows at work. And then when I discovered Linux, I kind of just discovered using a computer again. And actually, instead of seeing a computer and how it works and what it could do for me through the lens of what Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or their designers or the middle managers involved nowadays want you to do, I kind of wanted to build my own experience. I think that's the fun of this. That brings you back to the fun of the internet and the fun of computing when it first came out. And I think once you guys have a play with Linux, that'll all come back to you as well. So in a nutshell, I'm here to help out if you actually do want to try and need an extra hand. We've raced through a lot of information, so I'm sorry for blitzing through stuff. Again, for you guys who know Linux, I'm sorry for being so high level. But hopefully that was good. And hopefully for some people who don't know about it, that was helpful. And again, I think it's something for everyone to try. And as I mentioned, I'm always here to help. So that concludes the kind of presentation part of this, but we've added in, I think we've got 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so Q&A. So easy. I'm not sure how you wanted to manage that, but if there's some questions, would love to field them and see if I could add anything else really.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you very much, Eddie. First of all, that was brilliant. And I'm definitely thinking about the old laptops that we have lurking around the museum that might benefit from the development of Linux.
Okay.
As for chat questions, feel free to unmute yourself, folks, if you have a question, or pop it in the chat, and I will seal those to make sure that it sees them. So so free now to hire small people.
The picture you're showing us, Eddie, is lots and lots of different Linuxes. But you really have to make some sort of choice somewhere and commit to the distribution. Like, for old people like me, who've been around a very long time, learning something new is not necessarily the right way forward. And I'm absolutely wedded to Microsoft Office.
Okay.
In particular, Access and the like. I don't think I can run those under Linux distribution, or can I?
Well, that's a good question. So that is Microsoft Office in particular is something that keeps people on Microsoft because there is not, so Microsoft does not make clients or applications that run directly on Linux. However, all of Microsoft's major tools, Excel, Word, Outlook, Access, they're all web-based now. So a lot of people who run Linux 24/7 will use the web-based versions. But it's also important, and this is something I didn't mention if you're on Windows, Windows now has a brilliant system called WSL, which is Windows Subsystem for Linux. And what Windows has done is they've recognized how much Linux appeals to developers and people who want to try something different. And so you can actually go into the Microsoft Store on your Windows computer and download an instance of Ubuntu or Fedora. I think there's OpenSUSE in there. And it runs basically emulated inside Windows. And it gives you the chance to try out Linux a bit. A lot of people use that. But long story short, that's always going to be a case. You may not find every application in Linux, but there are workarounds. So you either go to the website or Linux has a lot of open source, kind of like for like applications as well. But yeah, I mean, if you're wedded to certain applications, that is always going to be something that will not move you over. In the Apple world, Adobe apps for creative people is very important. And Adobe likewise does not make apps for Linux. So people in Linux have had to write their own Adobe-like applications. There's something called the GNU image manipulation program, which is meant to be like Photoshop. But yes, those will always be it. And if you decide to jump in and I'm just going to be a Linux guy from now on, you're going to have to make some substitutions. So it may be a case that one machine runs Linux and your production work machines on Windows. A lot of people do that. Some people, and sorry, this is a long answer, but some people do what's called dual booting, which is that you put both Linux and Windows on your machine. And when you turn your machine on, you choose today, I'm going to go into Windows, or today I'm going to go into Linux. And that's another option as well.
Yeah, understood. My big problem with Office really is that I have a fair investment in Visual Basic for applications.
Okay.
And that's going to make things very difficult.
Yeah, I would say you got to keep a Windows machine around. Definitely, definitely, Derek. You're not going to want to get rid of Windows entirely. So maybe it's a case of an old laptop, you want to try Linux, or your next laptop, try it, but keep an instance of Windows around for sure.
Okay, thanks.
We have a raised hand. Stu, would you like to go ahead?
Hi there. Yeah, my name's Stu Goldsmith. Thanks very much for that presentation. I'm fairly long in the tooth as well as far as computing is going, but right now I don't have any installations other than Linux installations, and probably I've done so for the last 20 years. Can I just add something to your own presentation about introducing people? Is that for goodness sake, keep your data separate from your systems area, what in Windows term would be called the C drive, but the root drive. Because if you do have some problems with Linux, it's quite easy to decide to do a reinstall, and you might find yourself losing your data. So I would always recommend to people, and whenever I'm setting up systems for people, I set their data on a separate partition, if not a separate drive.
Really good.
I used to do the same for Windows as well, to be honest.
What distributions do you set up for people?
I've got Manjaro Cinnamon running in front of me right now.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, I like Manjaro. In fact, I know the project leaders, the guys that wrote Manjaro. I'm good friends with them. That's a great distribution.
Yeah, well, tell them I don't like what's happening in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, they always court a lot of controversy. That's for sure.
In terms of support, I mean, quite rightly, Arch, for instance, the support can be extremely vitriolic at times on that.
Yeah, that was the one I meant when I was saying some communities may not be as welcoming. Yeah.
Yeah. But I find when I'm working with the forums of the various distributions, you can ask a question and find yourself looking at answers which are 15 years old, 10 years old.
Yeah.
And unless you keep an eye on the dates on the things, you find yourself trying to do something and discover that that's been removed from the distribution long ago. And it's a feature which I found in lots of different places that I really like the support moderators to say, well, that's now old hat, or at least put some sort of date filter on saying, warning, this is an old answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, when I kind of first started, I would go to forums and, do exactly what you shouldn't do, which is copy and paste. Somebody inevitably gives you a line to drop in the terminal that fixes whatever problem is you just searched for. And I would paste it and plop it in, and that would be the end. I'd have to completely reinstall the operating system. So yeah, I mean, you're right. That is dangerous. The Ubuntu forums used to be really good at policing and managing, but they've kind of lost interest in the desktop bit, to be honest, and they don't seem to even be paying as much attention to their forums.
Right.
But you're right. There's a lot of old information. You need to look at dates, and don't do what I do. Don't copy and paste and drop in unless you're absolutely sure it's on the right version, and you trust whoever wrote that.
Look, I don't know how many non-Linux users are listening to you today. People who haven't tried it or tried it some time ago. As I say, I exclusively use Linux and have done for like 20 years. And where I live, I've got people who have got antique bits of hardware. So this is sort of trying to reinforce what you've just been saying, antique bits of hardware. And they just do not want to spend money buying another PC because, like me, they're a bit getting on a bit. And I've gone along and I've installed Linux Mint originally.
Yeah.
And now Manjaro and or at least you put Mate on, but now Cinnamon. And after about a week's worth of answering questions, they don't come back to me. They're quite happy running with it.
Yeah, that's great. And that's the thing is I've, you could put it on a machine with 2 gigs of RAM, some of these, depending on the desktop environment, and it runs. I mean, and some of these old machines, these Core 2 Duos that some people have still, and it breathes new life. And, we kind of just live in a world where we're throwing away and buying a new laptop even every 18 months. And that's crazy.
Yep.
That's what's great about Linux is that, as you say, you don't have to throw it away. Just put another distro on. And when you do, you put another distro, or as you've tried with Cinnamon or KDE or GNOME, put another desktop environment on, and it feels like you've just bought a new machine, really.
Yeah.
That's what makes it.
Well, I can see you've got another hand up, so I should have.
Okay.
Great talk. Thanks for that. One thing that I don't know whether you just pushed that because of time constraints, but an area that I always am constantly surprised I'm finding the growth in Linux is the embedded market.
Yes. No, I didn't include that. I should have.
Number of routers or even printers, DVRs, even cookers now that are coming with web servers embedded in them. It's often easier just to stick in a tiny little Raspberry Pi sized machine in there to provide your base functionality to be able to put your software on top of.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about Android as well, which runs Linux, they stick Android into every little device now as well, and just, put a skin on it, and have it run the smallest devices as well. So yeah, it's kind of proliferated into everything, but that's a really good point. I didn't mention embedded, and I didn't mention Raspberry Pi, which is obviously huge, not only for the maker community, but, for the ability to, embed a full computing device capable of doing all kinds of things in remote places, in other types of appliances, that kind of thing. So yeah, Linux is everywhere.
Looks like we've got a couple of questions in the chat as well. So we've got Earl has 2 questions. The first of which is, he would like to run some older applications that interact with PLCs for programming. Are these something that Wine could help with?
Potentially, yeah. I don't use Wine as much anymore. Wine is so basically, if people don't know, Wine is a Windows emulator. It helps you, well, it effectively helps you run applications, Windows applications in Linux. It's a little fussy, so it depends on which applications they are. You might have a better experience if you want to run Linux of running a virtual box, a virtual machine of Windows inside Linux. And that, again, could be now that I think about it, another solution um, for running Office as well. So yes, Wine running that emulator or running a virtual machine of Windows, either of those could be an option.
Thank you. And then our second question uses Visual Studio. Is there the next alternative?
Well, there's a lot of IDEs for Linux. A lot of people use Android Studio, which is by Google, and that is native on Linux. I think there's a Snap and a Flatpak. Those are different kind of packaging conventions. And that's a great IDE. But there's a couple of others. I don't do a lot of IDE development myself, but short answer is do a couple of searches. I would go to a place called FlatHub. So FLATHUB, where they have lots of applications and they've got a couple of different IDEs there that you can try.
Amazing. Thank you, Eddie. Also got a couple of comments from Al in the chat saying my dad installed Linux on our computers and I've been using this system for some years. We started with G-Compress? Maybe I'm saying that wrong. As children on Linux.
Oh, right. That's great. Yeah, I don't know what that is. I don't know. I don't know that one. And honestly, guys, if you took down my email address, just shoot me a mail. Love to chat about Linux. Some of the guys that we were chatting, if continue the chat, I'd love to. I love talking about it. So drop me an email, and if you guys want to try it and it seems daunting, or you want somebody to kind of walk you through it on the phone, again, very happy to do it.
Brilliant. Well, I am going to call this virtual talk a success then. Brilliant conversation, debate, questions from the floor, and a really, really wonderful presentation from yourself, Eddie. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming this evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.